The bells were already ringing when a woman in a plain grey uniform slipped through the side gate of Ravensworth Hall, and not one mourner turned to look at her. Snow drifted down over the stone courtyard, settling on the black feathers of the funeral horses and on the shoulders of lords and ladies who had gathered to mourn a duchess they had never once cared to know. While she lived, inside the chapel, an organ moaned low. Outside, a thin woman in a borrowed shawl stood with her head bowed, her hands raw from the cold, watching her own coffin carried up the marble steps by 6 men who had once laughed at her wedding. A footman pushed past her without apology. A lady in dark violet silk hissed at her to step aside, and from the open chapel doors came the soft, careless sound of a woman laughing, as though a small burden had finally lifted from her shoulders forever. The Duchess of Ravensworth, whose name was already carved into the cold stone of the family vault, lifted her face from beneath the shawl and listened to that laughter. Her grey eyes did not fill with tears. They filled with something far more patient, something that had been waiting a very long time. What happened next would strip that chapel bare of every coin, every title, and every lie it had ever held inside its walls. Before we step through those doors together, take one small moment. Press the subscribe button and tap that bell so a story like this one never slips past you again. And down in the comments, tell me the city you are listening from tonight and what hour the clock shows where you sit, because I want to know who walked through this story with me. Now, lean in closer and let the story begin properly. The estate of Ravensworth stood in the high country, a great pale house of creamstone set against black woods, with a lake the colour of dull pewter. For 7 generations it had belonged to the Harrowgate family, and its mistress for the past 3 years had been a quiet woman named Mirelle, Duchess of Ravensworth by marriage, and by birth the last surviving daughter of a private banking house, so old and so discreet that even the crown borrowed from it, without knowing whose seal backed the loan. She had been 22 when she married the Duke. She was 25 now, and the world believed her dead. The Duke himself, Alistair Harrowgate, had been kind to her in the careful, distant manner of a man raised never to disturb the surface of a still pond. A soft-spoken scholar of old maps who loved his wife the way a man loves a clear morning without ever quite saying the words aloud. But Alistair had a younger sister, and that sister had a mother, and that mother had a plan, and the plan had spent 3 winters quietly ripening in the dark. The sister was named Odette Harrowgate. She was 20, golden-haired, slender as a reed, with a laugh like crystal struck once by a silver spoon, and she had hated Mirelle from the very hour Mirelle first walked through the great doors of Ravensworth Hall. She hated her not for any sin, but for the simple arithmetic of inheritance, for the way a wife displaces a sister in the order of a great house, for the way any future child of that wife would push her aside entirely. And the mother of Odette, the Dowager Marchioness Cordelia Fenwick, hated Mirelle for colder and older reasons still. The Dowager was stepmother to Alistair through his late father, second marriage, and her own daughter Odette was, by the strict accounting of blood, only half a Harrowgate. To secure the future of Odette, the Dowager needed 2 things to remain true. Alistair must stay childless, and Mirelle must, by some quiet means, cease to exist. Mirelle had known none of this the bright autumn afternoon. She rode out to the village of Millbrook to deliver winter blankets to the cottagers there. She had known none of it when her carriage wheel cracked upon the stone bridge and the carriage tumbled into the swollen river below. She had known none of it when she clawed her way to the bank 1/2 mile downstream, bruised and gasping for air, and was taken in by an old midwife named Martha Greaves, who lived alone in a stone cottage at the edge of the woods. What Mirelle did come to know, lying in that cottage with broken ribs and a rising fever, was that her 2 attendants had been chosen by the sister of her husband, and that neither had reached for her when the carriage tipped. She knew the horses had been driven onto that bridge faster than good sense allowed, and that no one had searched the riverbank, though search parties surely rode out that same evening. And she knew, when old Martha returned from market a week later, with news that the Duchess of Ravensworth had been found drowned, and was to be buried within the fortnight, that something inside the great pale house had finally shown its true face. She did not weep when Martha told her. She sat very still upon the narrow cot by the fire, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, her grey eyes fixed on the small flame, and after a long while she only said that she would like another cup of broth. Martha, who had midwifed 3 generations of village children, looked at the young woman by her fire and understood she was not looking at grief, but at something quieter and far more dangerous, a stillness gathering itself the way a winter sky gathers snow before it falls. She asked no questions. She brought the broth, and for 2 weeks more she let the young Duchess heal in her cottage, while beyond the woods the great house prepared a funeral, and Odette ordered 3 new mourning gowns, cut so beautifully that the village dressmaker whispered to her own sister that the young lady must have ordered them weeks before the carriage ever left the stable. That whisper reached Martha, and Martha carried it like a small dark stone into her cottage and laid it gently at the feet of Mirelle. Mirelle listened. She did not speak. She rose the next morning and stood a long while staring at the black woods that separated her from her own home. She had been raised by a father who taught her that the world was a ledger, that every cruelty was an entry, and that the books were always, in the end, balanced. That father had died when she was 19, leaving her the great private bank that carried her family name, along with a chain of northern mills, shipping houses, and the largest single block of crown debt in the whole realm. She had told Alistair on the night of their engagement that she did not wish her fortune known publicly, that she wished to be loved as a woman and not as a sum of money. He had agreed and had loved that about her, never quite understanding that the same instinct which made her hide her wealth would also, in its hour, teach her how to hide herself entirely. That night, by candlelight, she wrote a single letter and sealed it with wax pressed by the iron handle of a kettle, having no signet ring to hand. She gave it to the grandson of Martha, a quick-footed boy named Toby, and told him to ride without stopping to the capital and place it into the hand of a man named Edmund Sorrel, director of the old bank on Silvergate Street. Toby rode. Mirelle waited, and while she waited, she made a decision that would one day empty a great house of its every lie. She would attend her own funeral, not as a duchess returning from the dead in triumph, for such a return could be denied and twisted, perhaps even silenced a second time. She would go as a servant, a tray in her hands and a plain cap over her hair, and she would listen. She would listen to what her sister-in-law said in unguarded moments, to what the dowager whispered to her allies, to what her husband said in grief, to those who only pretended to comfort him, and when she had heard enough, when the witnesses she needed had ridden in from the capital, she would lift the cap from her head and let the great pale house see exactly what it had tried to bury. Martha helped her dress for the role. The midwife had a niece in service at Ravensworth, a quiet girl named Bess Fairweather, who had wept when word of the death reached the kitchens, for Mirelle had once been kind to her. Through Martha, a message reached Bess, and a spare uniform was smuggled out of the laundry at dusk, carried through the woods wrapped in linen. By dawn on the morning of the funeral, Mirelle stood in the small cottage in a plain grey dress with a white apron and a white linen cap, her dark hair tucked away, her face shadowed beneath the brim, her grey eyes lowered. She looked, the old midwife said softly, like any girl in service. She looked like no one anyone would ever trouble to notice. Mirelle smiled then for the first time in 3 weeks, a small, cool smile that did not reach her eyes, and she said quietly that being no one was, on certain mornings, the most powerful disguise a woman could wear. She walked the long miles to Ravensworth alone through the snow, her shawl pulled tight, and arrived at the servants' gate just as the bells began to toll. Bess met her at the kitchen door, pale as the linen in her arms, and pressed into her hands a silver tray loaded with small glasses of warm spiced wine. Mirelle took it, nodded once, a small nod that said, "Be brave, be silent, watch," and stepped into the great hall of her own house as though she had never lived there at all. 200 mourners at least had travelled from the surrounding counties, all dressed in the careful black that polite society perfects over centuries of burying people it barely knew. Mirelle moved among them, lowering her eyes, offering wine, and she listened. She heard a lord remark that Alistair had borne the loss with admirable composure, hardly any tears, very dignified. She heard a young woman whisper that the Duchess had always been a strange creature, too quiet, too watchful, no real beauty to her, the sort of wife a man marries for the dowry and quietly forgets. She heard a banker ask what would become of the private estate, and heard the man beside him answer with confidence that it would all revert to the husband. The marriage contract had been very clear on that point. The hand of Mirelle did not tremble on the tray. The contract had said no such thing. She herself had signed it. Only her dowry reverted to Alistair upon her death. Her private fortune remained in her own name, to pass according to a separate document sealed inside the vault of the old bank, a document her own husband had never read. Whoever had told that banker otherwise had told him a useful lie, and that lie had a mother and a daughter and a price. She moved into the long gallery of family portraits, and there, beneath the painted stairs of 3 centuries of Harrogates, she found them. Odette stood by the fireplace in black silk cut so deeply, the older ladies of the county had not yet decided whether to be scandalized or impressed. Her cheeks pink from the fire rather than grief, her mouth curved in the small private smile of a woman who has won. Beside her stood the Dowager Marchioness Cordelia Fenwick, tall and gaunt, her white hair piled into a tower of mourning lace, her hands folded with the false serenity of a saint painted onto stained glass. Mirelle crossed the gallery slowly and stopped 3 paces behind them, exactly as a servant should. Neither woman turned, neither saw her at all. Odette said, in a voice almost tender, that the worst of it was over now, and that Alistair would need looking after, and that the Dowager must invite the right sort of young women to dinner, no one too clever, no one too rich, someone manageable who would not insist on producing an heir too quickly. The Dowager smiled thinly and said there was no hurry, that a full year of mourning would give them ample time to settle the question of the fortune first. Odette asked whether the lawyers had confirmed the holdings would pass cleanly. The Dowager answered that they would, that the late Duchess had been a foolish girl who signed whatever paper was placed before her, and that within 6 months the seal of Harrogate would sit upon the largest private bank in the realm. Then Odette laughed, very softly, and said it was almost a pity the bridge had only been a bridge, and not something more interesting. Mirelle, 3 paces behind them with a tray of sweet wine, did not move. She did not breathe. She let the words settle into her mind the way snow settles onto stone, gently and forever. And then she lowered the tray a 1/4 inch in silent salute to 2 women who had just confessed murder to a servant they had never bothered to see. She turned and walked away down the gallery, and in the quiet ledger of her mind, she began writing their names beside every debt they now owed. Now, before we go on, I want to pause the story for just a moment. If you have made it this far, you already know this tale is only getting started. So go ahead and drop a comment telling me whether you think the Duke ever suspected the truth, and share this story with someone who loves a tale of quiet revenge, because the next part is where everything begins to unravel. The service was held in the family chapel at noon. Mirelle stood at the back against the cold stone wall among the other servants, her cap pulled low, and watched her husband walk slowly up the aisle behind the empty coffin, his face grey, his shoulders bowed, and she felt for the first time since the river a small sharp pain beneath her breastbone, for his grief was real, and he believed her dead and was breaking quietly under that belief. He took his place in the front pew. Odette slipped beside him, took his hand, and pressed her cheek briefly to his shoulder in a gesture so perfectly calibrated that even Mireille, watching from the back, nearly believed it herself. The priest spoke of the late Duchess in the general terms reserved for women whose lives the speaker never troubled to learn. Her gentleness, her charity, her quiet support of her husband. He did not mention the village school she had funded, or the doctor bills she had paid for every cottager for 3 winters running, or the yearly pension she had settled on every retired servant of the hall. She had asked that none of these things be spoken of, and so they were not. After the service, the mourners filed back to the great hall for the funeral luncheon. Mireille resumed her tray and moved through the rooms more boldly now, for she had learned that no one ever looks at the face beneath a servant cap. She heard the steward, a sallow man named Osric Wendell, instructing footmen to pack the belongings of the late Duchess and carry them to the apartments of the Dowager for sorting. She heard Odette instructing a maid to remove every portrait of the late Duchess from the public rooms. She heard the Dowager remarking to a cousin that it was such a shame about the Renfield girl, of course, but that one had to be practical, and that Alistair had been most touchingly resigned to the will of Providence. The will of Providence. Mireille set down her empty tray and walked calmly up the great staircase, her hands folded before her as a servant on an errand might carry them, and let herself into the chamber that had been her own bedroom for 3 years. The room had already been disturbed. Drawers stood open. Her jewelry case was gone, and on the writing desk beside the window, weighted by a small bronze inkwell, lay a single sheet of paper written in a hand she recognized as her own, though she had never once in her life set it down. It was a letter addressed to her husband. It confessed, in sorrowful language, that she had grown unhappy in her marriage, that she had taken to walking alone by the river to clear her mind, and that if any harm should come to her by water or misadventure, he was not to blame himself. It was signed with her own name, in a hand so close to her own that for one cold instant she doubted her own memory of never having written it. She lifted the page. It was the work of a patient and skilled forger, planted there to be discovered by a grieving husband searching her chamber for some last word from her hand. She folded it once and slid it against her ribs into the bodice of her dress. She crossed to the small writing cabinet, lifted the false bottom her own father had taught her to build into every desk, and drew out a small leather-bound ledger no larger than her palm, holding, in her true hand, every private transaction she had made since her marriage. She slipped it into her apron pocket and closed the cabinet just as the steward, Osric Wendell, appeared in the doorway, watching her with narrowed eyes, trying to decide whether he somehow knew her. She curtsied low and murmured that the housekeeper had sent her to fetch the mending basket of the late Duchess for the poor. Wendell grunted, stepped aside, told her to be quick and not to touch the jewelry. She curtsied again, lifted a small basket from the foot of the bed, and carried it past him down the staircase and back into the noise of the funeral luncheon. It was during the 2nd hour of the luncheon that the child found her. She felt a small hand tug at the hem of her apron and looked down. A boy of perhaps 6 stood beside her, dressed in black velvet, his eyes enormous and grey, unmistakably the eyes of the Harrogate line. This was young Elian, son of the late elder brother of Alistair, left behind with his widowed mother in the dower house at the edge of the park. Mireille had always been kind to the boy, reading to him in the evenings and teaching him the names of the wild birds along the lake. He held up toward her in his open palm a small carved horse of yew wood she had given him on his last birthday, and told her, in the clear voice of a small child, that he had thought she had gone to live in the sky with the angels, but that he was very glad she had only been hiding. Mireille went still. Around them the murmur of the mourners continued unbroken, for no one paid attention to a servant being spoken to by a child. She knelt, brought her face level with his, and pressed one finger to her lips. Elia nodded with great solemnity, understanding at once that this was a game with very high stakes, and that he must be brave and silent. She whispered that he had done well to find her, and that he must keep her secret only a little longer. He nodded again and walked away across the hall on his small velvet shoes without looking back. The afternoon wore on. The light in the tall windows thinned toward the grey gold of a winter dusk. The mourners, well fed and gently warmed by wine that had once been hers, drifted toward the drawing rooms for the formal reading of certain provisional bequests, a custom of the county that allowed the immediate household to be settled before the full will was opened in the capital some weeks later. Mirelle followed at a distance, a tray of biscuits balanced before her, and took a place against the wall of the drawing room where the family and closest guests arranged themselves on the brocade chairs. Alistair sat at the front, his face still grey. Odette sat at his right, the dowager at his left. The steward stood behind them with a folio of papers, and a thin lawyer, Mr. Aldous Pemberton, cleared his throat with the dry sound of a man well paid to read aloud words someone else had written for him. He began. He spoke first of wishes regarding jewellery, which were, he read, that the bulk of it should pass to Odette in recognition of the sisterly affection that had grown between them. A small murmur of approval moved through the room. Odette lowered her eyes modestly. Mirelle, against the wall, did not move. Such a provision had never once been written by her. He spoke next of wishes regarding private correspondence, entrusted, he read, to the Dowager Marchioness for sorting in recognition of her maternal kindness. The Dowager bowed her head with the small grave smile of a woman receiving exactly what she felt owed to her. That provision, too, had never once been written by Mirelle. Then he spoke of the bank, the mills, the shipping houses, and the crown debt. All of it, said the lawyer, raising his voice as a man does when approaching the largest figure of his career, to pass in entirety to Alistair, held in trust for any future issue of his line, with the Dowager named principal trustee, Odette named secondary trustee, and the firm of Pemberton and Wendell named legal administrators of the whole arrangement. The room let out a soft collective sigh, the sound of a great deal of money settling comfortably in the imaginations of everyone present. Alistair lifted his head for the first time and frowned faintly at the lawyer, opening his mouth as though to speak. Odette laid her hand swiftly on his sleeve and murmured something soothing, and he closed his mouth again. The Dowager smiled very faintly and inclined her head toward the lawyer, who bowed low in return. Mirelle, against the wall with her tray of biscuits, lowered her eyes and felt the small leather ledger pressed against her thigh through the apron pocket, and she listened, in perfect silence, to her own murder being notarized inside her own drawing room. And she did not move, for she was waiting for one sound only, and that sound had not yet arrived. It arrived 17 minutes later, first as a tremor in the floorboards, then as the rising note of horses driven hard, then as the unmistakable rattle of not one carriage but many, sweeping up the long avenue toward the front of Ravensworth Hall. Heads turned, conversation faltered, the Dowager rose with a small frown. The steward stepped to the window, pulled aside the curtain, and stood very still. Then he turned, his face gone the color of old parchment, and said that 6 black carriages were coming up the drive, and that the lead carriage bore the seal of the crown. The room stopped breathing. Odette half rose from her chair. Alistair, blinking out of his fog, stood slowly. From the hall beyond came the sound of doors thrown wide, then the ring of boots on marble, then the voice of a herald announcing the arrival of Mr. Edmund Sorrel, principal director of the Bank of Renfield, accompanied by the solicitor of the king, Sir Rowan Blackwell, and a deputation of 6 magistrates of the Northern Circuit, upon a matter of urgent private justice concerning the house of Harrowgate. Mirelle set down her tray with great care, so the porcelain did not so much as click. She straightened, lifted her hands, untied the strings of her cap, and drew it slowly from her head. Her dark hair fell loose about her shoulders in a long, heavy wave. She let the apron drop to the floor. Beneath the plain grey dress, she was still bruised and thin, but she lifted her chin, and her grey eyes were no longer lowered. She stepped forward into the center of the room as the doors opened. The herald entered. Behind him came Edmund Sorrel, white-haired and grave. Behind him the solicitor of the king. Behind him the 6 magistrates in their dark coats. And behind them all, walking with the step of a woman who had known this hour was coming for 3 weeks, came no one, because Mirelle was already standing in the room. She had been there the entire time. She spoke. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. She said very quietly that she was sorry to interrupt the reading of her own will, but that there appeared to be certain inaccuracies in it, inaccuracies which, in fairness to everyone present, ought to be corrected at once. The room did not so much fall silent as cease to exist. Alistair made a sound that was not a word. Odette sat down very suddenly, as though her knees had been cut from beneath her. The Dowager Marchioness Cordelia Fenwick did not move, did not breathe, did not blink, her face gone the still white mask of a woman from whom every animating principle had quietly withdrawn. The lawyer dropped his folio, papers fanning across the carpet. A footman dropped a tray of glasses, and crystals sang as it shattered. Edmund Sorrel crossed the room and bowed before Mirelle as deeply as a man of 70 years can bow. The solicitor of the king bowed as well. The 6 magistrates removed their hats in unison. Mirelle turned to her husband, who stared at her as though she had walked straight out of his own grave, and said gently that she had a great deal to tell him, and was sorry he would hear most of it in public. But public was now the only place where such things could safely be spoken. Alistair took one step toward her. He stopped. His hand rose halfway toward her face, then fell again, for he did not yet know whether he was permitted to touch her, and his eyes filled with the helpless tears of a man who has just learned that the worst day of his life had been a lie. Mirelle looked at him a long moment. Then she turned, with the deliberate movement of a judge taking her own bench, and faced her sister-in-law, her stepmother-in-law, the steward, and the lawyer, who had between them written her death on paper. She said that she would now ask Mr. Sorrel to read aloud certain documents held in sealed deposit at the Bank of Renfield since the 2nd week of her marriage, documents which would settle, beyond dispute, the true disposition of her private estate. Sorrel stepped forward and drew from a leather case a folded parchment heavy with red seals. He broke them one by one in the silence of the drawing-room, and each crack of wax sounded like a small bone breaking. He unfolded the parchment and read. He read that the entire private estate of Mirelle, born Mirelle Renfield, the bank and all its holdings, the mills, the shipping houses, the crown debt, was held in her sole name, and that in the event of her death without issue it would pass, not to her husband, not to his family, but to a charitable foundation for the education of the daughters of cottagers throughout the counties of her birth, under the oversight of Mr. Sorrel and his successors. There would be no Harrogate claim on the Renfield fortune. There had never been any possibility of one. The document her own father drew up when she was 19 had made certain of that, and any paper claiming otherwise was simply a forgery. Sorrel lowered the parchment and looked at the dowager, his old eyes not kind. He said, in the dry voice of a banker who has spent 50 years calculating what men will do for money, that he had received the letter of the late Duchess from a village boy 3 weeks earlier, and had at once sent investigators to the bridge at Millbrook, where they found, beneath the broken railing, a saw cut in the timber so fresh the wood was still pale at the wound. A sworn statement from the village smith confirmed the cut had been made 2 nights before the carriage fell, by a man matching the description of the steward, Osric Wendell, who had paid the smith apprentice a silver coin to forget the small saw had ever been borrowed at all. Wendell made a small choked sound and stepped backward toward the door, and 2 of the magistrates moved, without any hurry at all, to stand between him and the threshold. Sorrel continued. He said the investigators had obtained testimony from the 2 attendants who rode with the Duchess that final afternoon, both of whom, once shown the evidence of the saw cut, had confessed to being paid by Lady Odette, in coin drawn from the private purse of the Dowager, to ensure the carriage crossed the bridge at speed, and that no rescue was attempted from the bank. A search of the apartments of the Dowager, conducted that very morning under warrant, had recovered a forged confession letter written in the hand of one Silas Crane, a known forger of the capital, whose signed receipt of payment had been found folded inside her own prayer book. Mirelle drew from her bodice the folded letter she had taken from her writing desk and said quietly that she believed this was the document in question. She handed it to the solicitor without once taking her eyes from the face of the Dowager. The Dowager did not move. Only her mouth had changed, opening slightly in the slack way of a person who has understood there will be no further move for her to make. Odette, still in her chair, began to laugh, a thin, high laugh, cracked and tinny, climbing the walls and breaking against the ceiling. She laughed and laughed, then stopped abruptly, looked at her brother with eyes gone perfectly black, and said, in a voice unlike her own, that he had always been a fool, and that the great pity of the Harrogate line was that it had ended in him. Alistair did not answer. He was looking only at his wife, the tears running down his face without his noticing, and he shook his head slowly. As though trying to wake from a dream, he was not certain he wished to leave. The magistrates moved forward, quiet and unhurried, took the Dowager by the arm, took Odette by the arm, and took the steward by the collar as he tried once more for the door, leading all 3 out through the great hall and into the waiting carriages beneath the falling snow, while 200 mourners who had eaten and drunk under that roof for an entire afternoon stood frozen in their good black clothes, watching the truth walk past them in irons. Mirelle stood in the center of the room a long while after the carriages had gone, her dark hair still loose, her eyes calm at last. Alistair crossed the floor to her, and this time his hand did not fall away. He touched her face as though he still did not believe it was real, and asked how long she had known, and how long she had been willing to wait. She told him the truth, that she had waited exactly as long as justice required, because a ledger once opened must always be balanced to the last entry. Young Elian ran to her across the hall and threw both arms around her waist, and she knelt and held him, and for the first time in 3 long weeks she wept. The great pale house of Ravensworth did not fall that winter. It stood as it had stood for 7 generations, but emptied now of every lie it had once sheltered, and it belonged at last and entirely to a woman who had learned to be no one for exactly as long as she needed to become, once more, herself. If this story stayed with you tonight, you already know what to do. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one, tap the bell so it reaches you the moment it arrives, and leave a comment telling me which character you will remember longest: the Duchess who waited, the husband who wept, or the small boy who kept her secret without ever being asked twice. Thank you for walking through this story with me, and I will see you in the next one.